Less than a quarter of the world's population enjoys freedom of speech as we know it. Only 12% of the world's constitutions guarantee freedom of the press. The right of people to assemble is violated in some country nearly every day of the year. The right to privacy and protection against unreasonable search and seizure is guaranteed in only 20% of the world's constitutions. In America, we sometimes take our freedom for granted. But if you think about it, Americans really are a very small minority in a world that's filled with governments that deprive their people of fundamental rights. What makes America different? Our Constitution is one very important factor. The United States has the oldest written constitution in the world. Now, it may look like just a dried-up old piece of parchment to some people, but it's actually a living document that guarantees each of us our personal privacy and freedom every day of the week.
One of the interesting things about the constitutions of other countries, particularly of Latin American countries, is that actually the letter of the law is quite similar to our own U.S. Constitution. What is different is how those laws are interpreted in practice. In theory, you have many of the same guarantees, such as freedom of expression, freedom of association, the right to a fair trial. But in practice, because of many of the extraordinary powers that the executive branch has in many Latin American countries, these guarantees are not, in practice, interpreted in the same way.
But even in America, we did not always enjoy the freedoms we have today. Before 1789, there was no Constitution. And before 1781, the United States was not a free country, but a collection of colonies, ruled by the King of England and the English Parliament, 5,000 miles away. As the colonies became more productive and self-sustaining, British rule became more oppressive. A stamp tax was imposed. British troops were forcibly quartered in private homes to enforce their laws. Ports were closed to all trade, and finally, martial law was declared. This extreme oppression led to the American Revolution. But once victory was won, what kind of government would take the place of British rule? Revolutions have often brought to power governments that were more unjust than those they replaced. The French Revolution and Robespierre's reign of terror is one example. Could the colonies improve upon British rule, or would they live in anarchy, with 13 separate colonies constantly at each other's throats? In order to govern themselves as a confederation, delegates of the states met in 1781 at the First Continental Congress. But the Articles of Confederation established in the Congress did not prove adequate.
The Articles of Confederation had several basic flaws, the primary one being that the national government which the Articles of Confederation created could not act coercively upon the states or the people. It could not legislate. It could only pass propositions which the states were required then to implement.
In 1785, a 34-year-old Virginian lawmaker, James Madison, saw that the states were weak and vulnerable without a strong central government. Alexander Hamilton, then 28 years old, also felt strongly that things had to be changed. It was largely through the efforts of these two young men that the delegates met again at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in May of 1787. 55 delegates from 12 of the 13 states met. The sharpest minds the states could assemble: George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. Together, they would complete a revolution that many of them had begun only a few years before. Madison and others were convinced that the new government should be composed of three separate branches: the legislature to create the laws, the executive to enforce the laws, the judiciary to interpret the laws. The first major controversy involved the creation of the legislative branch. The small states, usually less populated, feared that if votes in the Congress were based only on the size of a state's population, the small states would be left powerless by their larger neighbors. The large states were concerned that if each state had the same number of votes, then the results would be undemocratic. A delegate from Connecticut proposed a compromise. In the House, the number of representatives would be based on the population of a state. In the Senate, each state would elect 2 senators regardless of population. Article 2 of the Constitution, which creates the executive branch, also turned out to be difficult and controversial. How should power be divided between the Congress and the President? How long should the President serve?
Obviously, they did not intend to create the kind of executive that we have today. They couldn't envision it in the first place, but they wanted to create a balance. They wanted to create an executive that, through his veto power, through his treaty-making and foreign policy powers, had the authority and the power to withstand the incursions that would inevitably be made by Congress, because they perceived the abuses as coming in the future from the legislative branch.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I will faithfully execute the office of the Presidency of the United States. The office of the Presidency of the United States.
Finally, the delegates compromised on a 4-year term with the possibility for re-election.
Of the United States.
So help me God.
The President would be Commander-in-Chief of the military forces. He would make treaties, provided that 2/3 of the Senate agreed. And he would appoint judges, ambassadors, and other officers in the government. To guard against a president defying the law, the convention delegates created a process of impeachment by which the president could be replaced.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
It was the threat of impeachment that forced President Nixon to resign. Yet, during the Watergate hearings, Nixon refused to comply with a court order to turn over self-implicating tapes. How would the constitutional process be upheld?
President Nixon said, I won't comply with the court order. Well, stop and think, what could I do? He had the Army, Navy, the Marines, if necessary. What could the courts do? They don't have the power of the purse or the sword, as it is often put. No one could force him physically to comply. The only way the law would be upheld would be if the people rose up morally and politically, and by those means forced him to comply. And one wondered, I lay awake several nights worrying about it. Was I just exposing the helplessness of the law? Would the people rise up? Well, happily they did. And having said that he wouldn't on Friday, on Tuesday the following week, he sent his lawyer back to court and said, I will comply with the law. But it was the people that forced him to do it. And the law is effective against the executive only so long as the people recognize that it is our protection, their protection, against abuse of our liberties.
While the creation of the legislative and the executive branches was a difficult issue, the creation of the third branch of the new government did not generate much controversy. The delegates agreed early on the idea of a Supreme Court. They agreed that the Constitution and all laws made in accordance with it should be the supreme law of the land. Article by article, section by section, for 4 months, almost without a break, the delegates agreed and disagreed on points as they crafted a new Constitution. They even included a procedure for amendments to correct flaws in the Constitution that might later appear. To take effect, the new Constitution had to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states. The arguments for and against the Constitution boiled down to a battle between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists favored a strong central government, and the Anti-Federalists feared that a strong government would take away the freedoms won in the War of Independence. Known as the Federalist Papers, these arguments in article form remain today as the best explanation of the federal system of government. To guarantee individual liberties, the Federalists agreed to add the Bill of Rights. The Constitution was finally ratified, and the new government began on April 30th, 1789. Today, our Constitution may be considered one of the most powerful achievements of American democracy. Its Bill of Rights provides strict and permanent guarantees against governmental interference in basic American freedoms. Freedom of religious choice, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to trial by jury, and other essential rights. As great as the original document is, the Constitution has needed modification to allow for other basic freedoms originally left out. Freedoms often gained only after tremendous struggle. In 1865, the Constitution was amended to ban slavery. In 1879, the right to vote was guaranteed to people of all races. But it took nearly a century of social struggle to exercise that basic right. Prohibition went in and out of the Constitution, and in 1920, women finally won their right to vote. The most recent amendment was in 1971, when 18-year-olds gained the right to vote. There are today many amendments up for debate. School prayer, abortion, the ERA, a balanced budget. Any of these could require a constitutional convention to be called for a vote.
Past a far distance from our founding fathers who placed in this body the responsibility to direct...
In response to profound social changes in America, the Constitution has been amended 26 times in its 200-year history. The government we live under today works much as it was intended to, although the U.S. has vastly increased in size and population. In the legislative branch, the House of Representatives has grown from 65 members representing just 4 million people in 13 states to 435 members representing 235 million people throughout 50 states. Jefferson said that the House of Representatives should function as a standing rebellion, challenging the other branches of government and holding them to account.
Line of commitment in writing, be I Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, I'm going to believe.
When Jefferson said that the House should function as a standing rebellion, I think what he had in mind and how the House functions is that it is the group of representatives that is most closely attuned to the thinking of the people. And so when the people's, the nation's citizens thoughts on a subject change, and they can change dramatically overnight, you'll see that first felt in the House.
On the other side of Capitol Hill, the Senate has grown from 26 senators to 100, or 2 per state, just as agreed to in the Connecticut Compromise.
Senators are elected for 6 years, as opposed to the 2-year term of members of the House. And so there may be periods of time when they're not as subject to immediate electoral pressures. Senators represent wider constituencies than members of the House. They would represent an entire state and therefore respond to agricultural as well as urban concern. The Constitution grants to a Congress of the United States, which consists of a Senate and a House, all legislative power. Article 2 of the Constitution grants to the Senate the power to give its advice and consent to treaties. The President may not finally enter into a treaty with another nation unless the Senate, by 2/3 vote, gives its advice and consent.
As it was intended 200 years ago, today Congress plays a major role in developing national policy and in counterbalancing the powers of the executive branch. President Washington had just 3 cabinet departments: State, War, and Treasury. Today, the size and scope of the executive branch has grown substantially. The President directs 13 cabinet members and nearly 3 million civilian workers. The President today has become the best known and most influential person not only in the United States, but probably in the world. But while the powers of the presidency are immense, the President continues to be hemmed in by the many forces built into the federal system. The Supreme Court is one of those forces. Headed by the Chief Justice, the justices of the Supreme Court constitute the country's most powerful judicial body. The court's fundamental authority lies in the power of judicial review, the power to determine whether or not an act of Congress is in violation of the Constitution. Therefore, the Supreme Court is often the final check on what will or will not be the law of the land. This separation of powers between the 3 branches is one of the fundamental principles underlying our system of government. The second fundamental principle is the idea of federalism. Under a federal system of government, the states retain certain powers with which the national government cannot interfere. The third and final basic principle is the idea of checks and balances. Each branch has a method to check or balance out the powers of another branch. Accordingly, the President can veto an act of Congress. Congress can override the veto with a 2/3 majority vote, and the Supreme Court can strike down the law altogether. No constitution, however good, can guarantee a people's peace and freedom. But the success of our government does not come automatically. Ultimately, it is the people who decide what kind of government they will have.
What makes the American constitutional system the gem that it is and that it has become, I would have to say that it is the system of separation of powers.
It's an extremely flexible Constitution.
I think our Constitution has been a document that's shown itself to stand over the test of time.
We're celebrating a rather unique marriage between a document and a society.
George Washington wrote his friend Lafayette that the agreement among the delegates in Philadelphia was a miracle. I think it's an even greater miracle that a document written 200 years ago has served through 200 years of the most extraordinary changes of every kind.
Oliver Wendell Holmes, a distinguished Supreme Court justice, once said, "The Constitution is an experiment, as all life is an experiment. So far, the experiment has been a success. Whether it continues to be so is up to each American citizen.